Constitution, defending our Constitution, demanding the rights of we the people, broadcasting the truth the puppet media dare not report. Long live liberty and death to the New World Order. Prepare yourself. This is Real News Radio with your host, Farron.
Hello and welcome to the Real News Radio. This is our Saturday edition. We have been discussing the fact that the Constitution is in suspension. We have played the audio tape of John McCain admitting it in 1994. We have played FDR's inaugural speech. We have also had some that wouldn't come on and join us to discuss this topic. Virginia Fox, Judge Napolitano from Fox News. But we are honored today to have with us Dr. Eugene Schroeder, the author of Constitution, Fact or Fiction. And how are you doing today, sir?
Very good, Farron.
Well, Dr. Schroeder, it is a true pleasure to have you join us today. I have said on this broadcast, there hasn't been a guest I've looked forward to more than this one, and I know you're a true patriot. I want to thank you for all the work you have done to bring truth to light and expose something that has been purposely suppressed from the American people. And to begin with, just tell our listeners just a little bit about yourself and what inspired you to delve into studying the suspension of the Constitution, and then we'll get started with some of the facts and the specifics.
I was a farmer rancher and a veterinarian, and in the early 70s, we went through a crisis, not only in agriculture, I think here in the country, when Nixon took us off the silver standard. When that happened, he allowed the dollar to float, and of course there was a major devaluation in the dollar, and we had major inflation. At that time, the prices of agriculture commodities, being a farmer, those commodities rose in price along with everything else when everything inflated. But then, within a year, President Nixon put on price freezes, grain embargoes, and done various and sundry other things to knock the price of agriculture commodities back down. So we were left in a position in agriculture where we had very high costs, but the prices were back down to where they were prior to the time the prices went up. And as a result, that created a financial crisis in agriculture. That's how I became involved in studying ultimately the Constitution, because I knew that many thousands of farmers were foreclosed on, were put out of business, or family farms were taken because of government policy and government regulation. It had absolutely nothing to do with their ability to farm and produce food.
I have looked at your DVD. We have made copies of it. We've offered it free. Let's go back to 1933, and as we have said here, Congressman James Beck in 1933 said that one of the most damnable heresies when Congress declares an emergency, the Constitution is dead. So let's just start back with March 9th, 1933, FDR, and if you would, just take it from there and bring it forward. We will have a break at 9:17, and I will tell you, or you'll hear music in the telephone, but just go ahead and start for the listeners and just take them from the beginning to right now and all the information that you want to cover, and we'll just do it that way because I know that you know this stuff like the back of your hand.
In 1933, of course, America was in the midst of a Great Depression. We had a financial crisis very similar to the one that's going on now. And in the midst of that crisis, Franklin Delano Roosevelt became our new president. And in early March of 1933, when Roosevelt took office, in his inaugural address, he announced to the world that he was going to ask the Congress for a power that would be just as great as a power as if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe or a foreign army. In other words, he was going to ask the Congress for a war powers to deal with the crisis of the emergency. On March 9th, 1933, our Congress met in emergency session, and without ever reading the bill, passed the Emergency Banking Act of March 9th, 1933. And this act did in fact convey emergency dictatorial powers to President Roosevelt to deal with that economic crisis. For example, in that bill, it authorized him to seize the gold. In other words, the gold was the property of the American people. But absolutely, this bill allowed the president to seize that gold. And the way it done it was it amended an act of a World War I act that gave the president total authoritarian powers over enemies of the United States. But in the original
October 6th, 1917 Trading with the Enemy Act.
That's correct. It was the October Trading with the Enemy Act that gave the president total authoritarian powers over enemies of the United States who were within his reach, primarily within the continental United States or any place that he had jurisdiction to operate. He had total authoritarian power over enemies, but it exempted citizens of the United States because we were not enemies of the United States. We were citizens, and the president certainly could not have that kind of authority over us. But on March 9th of 1933, in the Emergency Banking Act, the Congress in that emergency session amended that Trading with the Enemy Act where the citizens of the United States were no longer exempt from those powers. So consequently, we were now treated the same as enemies of the United States under that act, and the president had total authoritarian power over our finances in that act. As a result of that, he immediately seized the gold as part of that. Of course, gold being the constitutional money of the United States. So it's obvious at that point, once he seized the gold, that anyone who studies the Constitution would know that the Constitution at that point was suspended. Within a very few days, the president then had the Congress pass the Emergency Agricultural Adjustment Act. And this act gave the president the same authoritarian power over agriculture. That's what got us involved, was then once the regulatory powers from the president and the executive branch came over agriculture, that we began to study then in the 70s, when we seen what happened to agriculture and how the regulatory powers just seized the family farms in many cases and put them out of business. So by studying that portion, that was how I then became aware that the problems had started not under the Constitution, but extra-constitutionally under these war powers that had been given to the president back in 1933 and had never been terminated. In fact, have never been terminated and continue yet to this day. And anybody that studies at all will know that. For example, the Federal Reserve System putting in several $1 trillion during the last year on their balance sheets to buy toxic assets and worthless assets, and putting in several $1 trillion to or checkbook dollars to bail out these banks and all this bad gambling that they were doing. Nonetheless, the banks done that, and they've done that under the emergency procedures that was given to them through Congress. They have no constitutional authority.
That's a perfect example of how that the government can completely legislate, just like by executive order, the president can legislate and totally bypass Congress and make them basically just ceremonial.
And that does it almost on a daily basis. And does it yet to this day. That's absolutely right, Fred.
We've took a lot of heat. I mean, when we come out after we found out about your information, and I did not know about it, I'll be honest, and it was a string of miracles how we came about finding out this information that you had put out years ago. But one of the things that people always ask, well, where do they get the authority to do this from the Constitution? And I'd like to ask you a little bit about that. If I'm not correct, Article 1, Section 9, the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless in the case of rebellion or invasion or the public safety may require it. And that's what they point to, the public safety. That's where they get the right, they claim, to suspend the Constitution.
Not only that, but also they claim that Congress has the power to declare war. And certainly they do, that only Congress has the power to declare war in our Constitution. And in fact, they did that many years ago, back in the 30s. That war has never been terminated.